On February 17, 2026, the Virginia House passed HB 642 by a 65-32 vote. The very next day, it moved to the Senate. That sounds procedural. Routine. Almost boring. But here's the unresolved issue. Virginia legalized possession years ago, yet retail sales still do not exist. So if a retail framework bill clears one chamber with a strong majority, what exactly is changing? And more importantly, is Virginia finally preparing to activate retail cannabis? Or is this another structural rewrite that never reaches implementation? We're going to unpack that carefully. Because the law says one thing. Enforcement says another. And legislative movement doesn't always mean market movement. Here's the counterintuitive legal fact. Here's the part most people miss. A bill passing the House does not mean cannabis stores are opening. It doesn't even mean retail is guaranteed. But, and this is critical, when a substitute rewrite passes 65-32, that is not symbolic. That signals coordination. And coordination inside the General Assembly is where outcomes start to shift. That sounds straightforward, but it's incomplete. Because what the bill changes structurally matters more than the headline vote. So, many Virginians believe one of two things. Either retail is already basically legal and just delayed, or it's politically dead. Both assumptions are too simple. What happened on February 17 suggests something more technical may be happening inside the legislature. But we need context before drawing conclusions. Welcome to Norfolk, Virginia Cannabis Hub, where we focus on Virginia-specific cannabis law, local governance, and regulatory clarity, so you understand what the law actually says, not just what headlines suggest. This is not speculation. This is not promotion. This is a structural legislative analysis of HB 642 and what its movement actually signals. We are not discussing how to sell, grow, or consume cannabis. We are discussing governance, compliance architecture, and enforcement reality. Here's the context. Virginia legalized possession in 2021. But retail sales required reenactment legislation. That reenactment stalled. Since then, multiple retail bills have been introduced, and most never leave committee. That's the pattern. Bills are filed, debated, amended, then quietly stop moving. This time, HB 642 passed the House. Not narrowly. Not symbolically. 65 votes in favor. Now, that does not guarantee Senate approval. But it breaks the usual pattern. And this is where confusion begins. Because legalization headlines created the public perception that retail was inevitable. In reality, Virginia operates under a tightly controlled medical framework with limited pharmaceutical processors. Adult-use retail activation requires structural code changes. HB 642 appears to be attempting that structural rewrite. But that raises the enforcement loop. If the structure changes, who controls it? Here's the legal explanation. HB 642 is not a short amendment. It is described as an amendment in the nature of a substitute. That phrase matters. It means the original bill was replaced with a rewritten version. Entire chapters in Title 4.1 are being amended or added. That suggests licensing categories. Retail structure. Regulatory authority expansion. Potential tax allocation adjustments. There is also a fiscal impact statement from the Virginia court system. Now, pause there. When courts issue fiscal analysis, it suggests projected enforcement implications. More accurately, it suggests anticipated caseload impact. That is not symbolic language. That indicates expected legal activity. But here's where we slow down. A structural retail framework does not automatically override local zoning authority. It does not eliminate advertising restrictions. It does not remove enforcement discretion. The law says one thing. Enforcement says another. And that distinction becomes critical if this bill advances. Because retail authorization and retail accessibility are not identical. How enforcement works. If HB 642 becomes law, enforcement would still involve Virginia's Cannabis Control Authority, local zoning boards, state regulators, potentially local law enforcement and licensing compliance reviews. Retail authorization on paper would still require local approval, zoning compliance, permit alignment, operational inspections. And if localities retain opt-out authority, which many prior bills included, entire cities could remain closed to retail despite statewide authorization. This is where outcomes diverge. Because a statewide vote does not guarantee a Norfolk storefront. And it does not guarantee Hampton Roads participation. Earlier I mentioned the unresolved issue: retail exists on paper but not in practice. This is where that issue becomes real. Now we need to shift perspective. Because this is the turning point. Most people ask, did the House pass retail? That's the wrong question. The better question is, did the House pass a structure capable of surviving Senate scrutiny? That depends on political alignment, committee interpretation, fiscal modeling, and enforcement implications. The law says one thing. Enforcement says another. Even if HB 642 passes both chambers, implementation timelines, rulemaking authority, and regulatory drafting could delay activation for months, or longer. This is where people stop watching legislation, and where surprises begin. Who this affects? Consumers. Virginia residents who believe legalization already includes retail may misunderstand timing. Structural passage does not mean immediate storefront access. Retail entrepreneurs. Business owners watching this bill need to understand that licensing caps, application requirements, and equity structures may change significantly. Local governments. Cities like Norfolk will need to evaluate zoning overlays, buffer requirements, and permit procedures if retail activation becomes real. Medical framework participants. Existing pharmaceutical processors may see expanded competition or structural modification. Each group faces a different risk profile depending on Senate action. Why this matters? This matters because legislative movement changes expectations. Expectations influence investment. Investment influences local politics. And local politics influences zoning. Public safety considerations will resurface. Equity fund allocations could expand. Tax modeling could shift municipal revenue assumptions. But again, and this is important, passage through one chamber does not equal operational activation. It signals alignment. Alignment is the beginning of regulatory implementation, not the end. Let's look at a scenario. Earlier I mentioned the silent question. Is Virginia finally activating retail? Let's walk through two scenarios. Scenario 1. HB 642 passes Senate, Governor signs, rulemaking begins, regulators draft retail license categories, localities review zoning, Norfolk allows limited retail corridors. Retail opens, but only in approved zones. Timeline, 12 to 24 months. Scenario 2. HB 642 passes Senate, Governor signs, but implementation language requires reenactment or rulemaking delays push enforcement out or localities broadly opt out. Retail authorization exists on paper. But storefront access remains limited. Small distinction. Massive outcome difference. This is where the law says one thing. Enforcement says another. The difference between statutory authorization and operational activation is where cases, and businesses, turn. And this bill's language will determine which path Virginia takes. Here's what to watch next. Watch the Senate committee vote. Watch for amendments. Watch for effective date language. Watch for local opt-out provisions. Watch the governor's posture. And most importantly, watch implementation timelines. Because timing changes everything in regulated markets. Here's a question to think about. If Virginia activates retail, will your city participate? Or will local zoning quietly shape access more than statewide authorization? That is not political. that is structural. And that is where most people are surprised later. If you want a deeper breakdown of the substitute language, fiscal modeling, or how this could affect Norfolk specifically, let me know in the comments. Tell me which section of HB 642 you want analyzed next. And if you want to continue this discussion at a compliance level, join the Norfolk City Cannabis community. Subscribe for ongoing Virginia-specific legal updates. Because this is not about hype. It is about architecture. And architecture determines outcomes.